else, okay? All right, any other questions before we get started? No? Okay. So we're going to start a new topic today. And this topic is a little bit different than topics we've done before. It involves land use. Now, we've done land use in the context of zoning. I'm sorry, in the context of nuisance, right? If person A is using your land in a way that's harmful to person B, a nuisance suit can be used to stop that. This is different. Instead of using private lawsuits to regulate land use, zoning uses the power of the state to regulate land use. And though this topic is not constitutional law, it intersects with constitutional law in a lot of ways, so we will have to talk about the Constitution today. I want to start you off with this question, and I'm going to turn this off if you didn't check in and see me after class. This is your question I want to start you off with today. Okay? The question is this. The government can deprive the value of your property without providing just compensation. Actually, deprive you of typo. Should make a difference. True or false? Go. Another couple seconds. All right, stop it there. Who is last? Are you next? Lila, you're next. What do you think?
False.
You think it's false. Why do you think it's false?
I think that's probably something about constitutional laws that the government
Now you said they take your property. What was the question that I wrote there? Isaac, what do you think?
I think sadly that the answer is a true, because while it should not be the case, they certainly can, because the central planners at the zoning committee can make whatever declarations they want without any regard whatsoever for how it's going to affect you, the property owner.
You say that phrase "central plan" with such contempt in your voice. tell us what you really think. No, that's going to do. That's what I think.
Is it true?
Why is it true?
It has to be a serious deprivation and taking it in a per se rule.
Oh. So let me put the results up. I'm guessing it's going to be 50-50. That's my guess. Whoa! Have we ever had that before? All right. So our friend visiting. What's your name?
Clayton.
Break the tie. Break the tie. Is it this? He applied to South Texas. Hope it comes here next year. Break the tie. You got 50-50.
I think it's A, because in this instance, I think it's a monetary value of the property more in line with an appraisal. Depending on the zone, it can significantly affect the value of the property.
So our friend is correct. He broke the tie is correct. The answer is A. So yeah, so skip law school, save your $100,000. Just pocket it and go invest it. This, my friends. This is the question that we'll be grappling with the next 3 or 4 weeks or so, right? Now, Delilah said exactly right. We have this provision in the Constitution, which is called the Takings Clause, right? and it says, there's a Fifth Amendment. It says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. There's a couple things there, right? What's private property? What does it mean for it to be taken? I think I started messing with Delilah about that a minute ago, right? What does it mean to take property? Does it mean to physically take it from you, that you can't use it anymore? Does it mean to enact some sort of a zoning law, or maybe an environmental law, or some other restriction that diminishes the value, deprives you of the value, right? What's public use? We'll cover that in the very last day of class. If they take your property to build a road or a highway, a hospital, what about a football stadium? What about a hotel? What about an office complex, right? What is public use? We'll get through the last week of class. And there's this other provision, right? Without just compensation. How do you compensate someone justly for taking their property? What if they have sentimental value? What if the fair market value doesn't come close to compensating a person for their loss? So we'll do that other stuff later, but for now, I want to focus on word taking. Or taking, right? This is called the takings clause. T-A-K-I-N-G-S, the takings clause, because it involves the taking of property. Now, I think Delilah and Isaac and a few other people already hinted at this. What does it mean to take property? So there's a distinction in the law. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's pretty hard and fast. If you are losing title to your property, that you're literally taking a piece of land from you, right? That's going to be the taking, no doubt. Right? If you own Blackacre and then you lose Blackacre, that's going to be a taking. Beyond that, it gets real complicated. What if the government makes you install a wire on your apartment building so that your tenants can have cable TV? Is that a taking? We'll get there. You're right. What if the government imposes a zoning ordinance that says you can only build a one-family home here, but you can't build an apartment complex? Is that a taking? What if the government says your building can only be 50 feet high, not 100 feet high? Is that a taking? Now, all of these items result in diminishing your property value, right? You want to build an apartment building, but you're stuck building a one-family home, right? All of these items diminish your property value. So going back to our magic question of the day, which broke you guys 50-50, that's pretty good. That's exactly what I expected. The mere fact that the government is depriving you of the value of your property does not automatically trigger the takings clause, right? The mere fact that the value is being deprived, the value is being lessened, does not automatically trigger the takings clause. The takings clause is only triggered when, as the name would suggest, there is a taking. And the courts have developed this very elaborate framework that makes no sense to decide when something's a taking, right? You guys have been blessed so far this year. Hashtag blessed. You have no Supreme Court cases. Now you do. Now you deal with the Supreme Court and they mess everything up. Whenever the Supreme Court touches something, it becomes garbage. That's why I actually love this class more than common law. I truly do. Because there's law, there's rules, right? It makes sense. But once we get to SCOTUS cases, it gets out the window. It just goes down the toilet, right? But you'll have to deal with it. So the takings clause is only triggered when there's actually a taking, which makes sense. Okay? So you have this balance, right? Now, page. What gives the state the power to enact a zoning law, zoning committees that regulate land use? What do we call that? Phrase we used a number of times before. Travis?
Is it police power?
Exactly. Police power. Right? Travis, what's the police power?
It gives the government the authority to protect like health and safety of citizens.
Exactly. Yeah, the police power, right, is this sovereignty of the states, this power of the states that gives them the power to regulate the health, the safety, the welfare and indeed the morals of the people. We'll do some morality later this semester. Now, Alex, where does the police power come from? Where's this power come from? Take a guess. Does the Constitution say states have a police power? You're talking really low. I can't hear you.
I wouldn't say explicitly, no.
So where does it come from? What?
It's incorporation, where we're talking about applying rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights to like the federal government and applying that to the states.
Well, incorporation is a good start, but that refers to people. People have rights. Governments have powers. Where does the government get the power from? Government does not have rights. Make sure to make that mistake. People have rights.
I thought that had something to do with any rights not reserved by the federal government are allowed the states.
You have the 10th Amendment, right? And the 10th Amendment basically says any powers not given to the central government are reserved to the states. That's close. But where do the states get that power in the first place from? Anyone know the answer? Take a guess? Yeah? No?
The people?
Yeah, where do they get the police power from? That's my question. Anyone want to take a guess? What? Oh, God, you're way for Lochner. I'm actually taking Lochner this afternoon, so you're right on target. No, it's not Lochner. Let me try it like this. You're not getting off that easy. So, William's right. The 10th Amendment says whatever powers are not given to the federal government, the state's reserved. So, Christina, before the 10th Amendment, before the Constitution was ratified, where were those powers vested then? Who had the power before the Constitution was ratified? Yes. Explain. How did it go from the king to the Constitution? Explain that. You're exactly right. What happened between the king and the Constitution? Even before the Constitution, what happened? How did the power from the king move on? What happened? You're exactly right. You're so close, so close. Mia?
Didn't, like, the colonies just take it?
From whom?
The king?
Yeah, exactly right. The significance of the Declaration of Independence, right? This wasn't just saying a see you later, right? It wasn't just a goodbye. It was effectively saying that we are now, as the 13 colonies being 13 states, sovereign. And whatever powers the king had were now the powers of the state. That is the origin of the police power, right? The origin of the police power, whatever authority, was derived from independence. Right? That's where it came from. The king had complete control of the colonies. We declared independence. And then that became powers of the states. Now, the Constitution, though, gave up some of those powers. The Constitution gave up some of those powers. For example, the states gave Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. They gave Congress the power to declare war. They gave Congress the power to negotiate and ratify treaties. Right? The states relinquished. The states gave up some of their own police power to the central government. Everyone understand that, right? The reason why our federal government's power is that the states initially relinquished it back in the 1790s. So generally, the state's police power was not subject to any sort of federal control until what happened, though? What happened, Teller, that changed the state's police power? What new constraint emerged that controlled the state's police power? It was a big thing that happened in our country 150 years ago to the next year. What happened? That radically changed the relationship between the states and the federal government. Okay, good. And what was the consequence of the Civil War? What happened after that from a legal perspective? a really big thing that happened. It does. What was a big thing that happened legally after the Civil War?
The federal government took over to rebuild the state.
There was Reconstruction, but what else? What am I talking about? Lane? There's a huge legal development that really changed things after the Civil War. I spent a month on it in Commonwealth. Yeah. Which one? It's an amendment. Yes, which one? It's a biggie. Bingo. 14th Amendment, right? The 14th Amendment did a lot, and I don't want to talk about all that stuff here. I do want to talk about one provision, though, which is relevant to our topic today. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. It provides, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or thank you, property, I'll give there's a connection, without due process of law. So before the 14th Amendment, Emma, if a state wanted to take your property, were they required to give you any compensation before the 14th Amendment?
No.
That's right. How do we know that? You're right. You're exactly right.
It's not in the Constitution. The Constitution says the federal government.
Exactly. So there was a case I remember called Barron v. City of Baltimore. John Marshall opinion, right? And that decision said that the Federal Bill of Rights, the first 8 amendments, do not control state action. The first 8 amendments don't control state action. So the 5th Amendment only restricts Congress from taking property, not the states. So before 1868, actually when the 14th Amendment was ratified, before 1868, there were no constraints on the power of the states in the exercise of their police power. Let me say that again. Before the 14th Amendment, the state's police power was virtually unfettered. They could do whatever they want. Short, very small exceptions about ex post facto and bills of attainder and contracts clause, but without fail, the states could do virtually whatever they wanted. That changed by the 14th Amendment. Now, if the state wants to deprive you of your property, they must afford to you due process of law. And at least as it's understood today, one of the liberty interests protected by the 14th Amendment is the takings clause. One of the liberty interests protected by the 14th Amendment is a takings clause. So if the state wants to take your property, we back up to the 5th. They must provide you just compensation. So these were significant changes to the state's police power. That the state wants to take your property, they must pay compensation. And if the state wants to deprive you of your property, they must give you a due process of law, which at a minimum means some sort of hearing, right? They can't just arbitrarily take it. They have to have some sort of judge or some sort of legal proceeding to seize the property. Right? So all of this is a long way of saying that the state's police power, the state's power to zone, is controlled by the 5th and the 14th Amendments. So any question you get on zoning, the first thing you have to think about is, okay, does this run afoul of the 5th or the 14th Amendments? Right? That's your question to think about. The hard question is, how do you know if it runs afoul of the 5th or the 14th Amendment? And here's a rule you're going to hate. You're going to hate it. If it's a taking, you have to provide compensation. If it's an exercise of the police power, you don't. How's that for an awful rule, right? If it's a taking, you have to provide compensation. If it's merely an exercise of the police power, you don't. Yes, sir.
Does that distinguish between a physical and a regulatory taking?
Oh, you're getting ahead of yourself. Yeah. So we'll say that next week. There are different kinds of takings. So don't give more confusion than needed, right? But at a minimum, if it's a taking, right? If it's a taking, you have to provide compensation. If it's an exercise of the police power, you don't. Now the question you're asking is, Josh, how do you know if it's a taking or an exercise of the police power? Right? Is that someone's gonna raise your hand next? Give me 3 weeks, right? It's a very complicated area. But what you just have to remember is, if this is an exercise of the police power, then there's no requirement for any sort of compensation. Now, Isaac alluded to this before, but the long and short of zoning, right, the bottom line of zoning, is that it's an exercise of the police power, right? It's an exercise of the police power. So it doesn't require compensation under the Fifth Amendment. That's not the end of your story, because you got 2 amendments to worry about. Not just the 5th, the 14th. Even if a zoning law is part of the police power, it still must provide due process of law. And this is the easiest way for you to screw this exam question up. I promise you. I promise you. If you just give me the 5th Amendment, you're halfway there, but you're not home. You have to also the 14th Amendment. And that's what's the subject of the very first case, Euclid. Right? They say pretty quickly this is not a taking, this is no compensation. They go through that pretty quick. But the bulk of the opinion concerns the other element, whether it runs afoul of the 14th Amendment's due process clause. Here's what's going to drive you nuts. Due process does not only mean you get a process, a hearing, right? Due process of law has a little bit more to it. Is this action arbitrary? Does it make sense? Is it unreasonable? This is what you learned about last term in common law, I hope you did, of substantive due process. The notion that the due process clause does not merely regulate hearings, juries, trials. It also concerns the wisdom of legislation. If any of you are interested, I'm actually teaching substantive due process today, teaching Lochner, in fact, this afternoon. You're welcome to have a double dose of Josh if you can stand it. I would recommend it. It might be hazardous for your health, but you're always welcome to come to my other class if you want. I'll be doing this exact same spiel in a couple hours, so it's the same shtick, but maybe a little bit more in depth. Lord help me, twice in one day. Isaac, didn't you have me twice last semester?
My 3rd time having it.
I'm so, but you had me twice in the same day, didn't you? Or was it two?
I don't remember if it was the same day.
But yeah,
It was 4 times a week.
Yeah, you had me 4 times a week, so he can survive. But he has emergency training, right? If you can survive me, everything else piece of cake. So everyone get that general frame. You need to look at all the zoning and takings questions through both the 5th and the 14th Amendments. And I can mess with you on this exam. I can just say, is this constitutional? I don't have to tell you 5th and 14th. You have to know that, right? I'm telling you, you need to know it to go through the entire regime. You can't just stop at one thing. So we'll do the takings clause much more next week. We'll do police power and 14th Amendment today and next week. So everyone are okay with that so far? Don't let me down that one. I want to make sure you guys get that. Okay. You good? You good? Makes sense? Thank you. You're not taking any notes, I know that's okay.
I'm following along.
Okay, good enough.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So when we have a zoning question, does it matter? We always need to apply both amendments, no matter if it's the state or the federal government?
So, I'm not going to give you a question where the federal government takes property, because it's a very strange item. Generally, the federal government doesn't take property unless it's in the federal territory. So I probably won't ask you about that. But you need to understand that under current law, the 5th Amendment applies equally to the states and federal government.
Okay.
There's actually a pretty good argument, and I don't want to bore you with it, that the federal government lacks a power over an eminent domain. I think it's probably right. Basically, they can only take some property in federal places, like maybe the District of Columbia, but that's about it. They can't really exercise it anywhere else. They do, but it's weird. I'll leave it there. But yeah, it'll almost always be states. I don't think I've ever once asked in my many years of teaching this class if the federal government uses the power. But to put the point more finely, The 14th Amendment applies to the states, right? There's a due process clause in the 5th Amendment as well that applies to the feds. The analysis would be exactly the same, but I won't ask about the feds. Too complicated. Everyone with me? Okay, let's move on then. Where was I up to? Alex, I think you're next.
Oh, yeah.
Alex, tell me this. Why did zoning laws come about? Why did they become something that was developed?
Understanding.
I'm sorry?
I think to keep certain areas like for residential use only and then other areas for light industrial use.
Well, that's what they did, but the question is why? Why did they go about doing this?
Well, like policy reasons, like safety and such.
Well, Alex, let me ask you this question differently. What tools were available before zoning to accomplish these sorts of land use control? What could people use beforehand?
They didn't have like a formal way of doing it, so
What could they use? If you didn't like how your neighbor was using his land, what could you do?
you just complain and like sue them.
Sue him for what?
Nuisance.
Ah, nuisance. What else could be used? If you didn't like how your neighbor was using his land, what else could you use? What were we just studying last week?
Oh, covenant.
Covenants. Yes, ma'am. Right. Servitudes, right? So traditionally, historically, land use was regulated through private action. You could sue your neighbor for a nuisance, right? Or if you wanted to be a little bit more savvy, you could buy a covenant. Or maybe get an easement. Land use was done on a case-by-case basis where you were regulating either through court or through a private transaction with your neighbor. Now, Valerie, what's the difficulty with trying to use covenants and easements and nuisance laws to handle an increasingly complex society?
Well, they'll open the doors for further litigation, and it wouldn't be uniform.
What do you mean it wouldn't be uniform?
Well, if one person, let's say, got a nuisance suit and can't build a factory, what if like 3 streets down, they could build a factory, and then the other person has to sue them, and it's just.
Yeah. Natalie, what sort of problems can arise if we have to only resort to private litigation to handle these sorts of issues?
It would be inefficient for a group.
Yeah. Give me more, explain more, you're exactly right. What's the inefficiency there?
So if an entire neighborhood was affected by something, it'd be inefficient for each person to individually sue whoever was creating
Right.
the problem.
Exactly, so I think all three of you got it right in the head. Using covenant, nuisance law, easement law to regulate land use becomes very difficult in an increasingly crowded society. If you're living out in the country and your neighbor's 2 miles away, you can probably live with him being a jerk. But when you have many people crammed into a fairly small area, it becomes almost impossible. Because I think Alex and Valerie said it right. Every individual person would need to then bring litigation, right? You would need to then have individual suits. You need to have individual easements, individual covenants. And what do you know about covenants? It's only binding the parties that are in the transaction. And if you don't draft a covenant right, the next guy comes along and he's not bound by it. So fairly, in the early 20th century, the early 1900s, people began to recognize that there are shortfalls in land use with covenants and easements and nuisance. So the idea of zoning developed as a way to address these problems on a much bigger scale. So I think Natalie said uniformity, right? Or maybe it was Valerie. Uniformity was exactly what zoning was trying to do. They said each block in a certain area should look the same. And it should not depend on one person filing a lawsuit in this court, someone filing a lawsuit in that court, etc. Another big change about zoning is that you know in advance what the rules are, right? If you're using your land in a certain way and you're just waiting to get sued, you don't know what the law is going to be until the court resolves it and all the appeals are finished. With zoning, they say here in advance, this is what the rule is going to be. This is what you can build. It's going to be this height, it's going to be this width, this, this number of bedrooms, whatever else. So it shifts it. And instead of just building it and waiting to get sued, instead you have to seek permission in advance and meet whatever guidelines the government asserts. So it was a very significant change in the way construction was done. In the old days, you bought Blackacre, you built whatever the hell you want, maybe you got sued, maybe you didn't. Here, you buy Blackacre, you can't break ground until you get a permit, until the zoning board gives you a license to build. And they'll tell you exactly what to build. So it decreases litigation on the back end, but as we'll see, it increases the litigation on the front end. When people get their permits denied, they go sue, right? So it merely shifts the cost. But again, who are you suing? It's not neighbor suing neighbor. It's the builder suing the government, right? It's the builder suing the zoning commission. So that way, the neighbors don't have to band together and file a lawsuit at their own cost. They can just petition the zoning board to deny the easement. You have a hearing, you say, oh, deny this guy's easement, deny this guy's covenant, deny this guy's building permit, whatever it is. So it radically shifts the way construction operates. These laws developed fairly quickly in the early 1900s, and a lot of states enacted what are called enabling acts. An enabling act. Philip, what's an enabling act? What does that mean? A state zoning enabling act.
Like an act that allows a municipality to...
Exactly. So who has the police power? The states. Texas has the police power. But Texas has the power to delegate that authority down to a city, to a county, to a municipality of any size. So what these enabling acts did was they allowed small places like the village of Euclid, for example, to exercise a zoning power. That way you wouldn't have to lobby the state legislature every time you want to make a zoning change. It can be done on a local, municipal level. Are there any questions about that? We're almost there. Almost at the first case, I promise. There's a wind up for that. So, Kayla, so we have these new zoning laws, right? That came around the early 1900s. You are a constitutional lawyer back in that time period. Your client comes to you, he says, look, I don't like this law. How can we challenge it in court? What are your arguments? What do you bring? What do you say we're going to sue on?
Oh wait, when am I constitutional?
In the early 1920s.
Okay.
Here.
The
14th and what amendment?
Fifth.
Thank you. 15th Amendment, probably not relevant here, but yes, the 14th and the 15th. 14th and 5th Amendment, you're exactly right. So, Kayla, just sketch for me at a high level. You're in the 1920s, right? Early 1920s. What is the argument that this zoning law, these sorts of zoning laws, run afoul of the 5th Amendment? What's the argument?
That since it's lowering my client's property value, it's in turn essentially taking their rights.
And therefore, what must the government do?
Compensate.
Yes, compensation, right? So the first argument is, look, they're depriving the value of my property. I want to build a skyscraper, I want to build an apartment complex or something else, and they say, no, you have to build a single-family home residence, that's it. I could be making millions of dollars with commercial, but instead I have to have a couple $1,000s with my with the one-family house. Now, Kayla, are they actually taking your property from you physically? Are they removing it from you?
No.
Yeah, so you have to go down the route saying the diminishment of the value of the property, dropping the value of the property, runs afoul of the amendment. Okay. We're okay with that. Simone, what? Oh, sorry, Matt.
I was just going to ask, how does that kind of answer my question? But how does the Fifth Amendment and that whole concept of we can take as long as we pay you, how's that reconciled with the theory that property's unique? You can't usually it goes towards specific performance as opposed to damages. Like,
Oh.
so if he really wants that piece of land for whatever use, it's like that's his land. There's no other land like it. How can they just take it?
So
and get
why
it
does
on?
it? So this is what's called eminent domain, right? The phrase is eminent. People always spell it wrong. It's not imminent domain. If you write something down, I'll be very mad at you. Not Eminem. Eminent, not imminent. Eminent. Why does the government, Matt, have the power of eminent domain? Why is this an essential attribute of state sovereignty?
Like,
Why did the framers specifically give in the Bill of Rights a recognition for this eminent domain power? Why is it so significant?
I guess just policy reasons, the ability to govern. It's like,
Why? Yeah, you're right. I think you're right. What does it mean, ability to govern?
I don't know how to phrase that. I guess just in broad terms, the ability to ensure the welfare of the people.
Why? If the government did not have the power of eminent domain, what would happen? What would not work?
Their ability to enforce law at all, I guess.
What do you mean? It's your question.
Like they would have any authority? Oh, I see what you're saying.
If one person's use or enjoyment of their property infringes on another person's, there needs to be some sort of mechanism or function for the government to sort of have the authority to stop it.
Good.
You never get anything built. You never get any roads built. You never get any house built. You never build any of that.
You know what else I think, Deb? Yeah, I think these answers are right on target. If it was the case that the government couldn't seize property, you could never build a road. You could never build a post office, right? You would never build a hospital. Why? Because if I know the government needs this property to build a road, and the government basically has unlimited amounts of money, which they basically do, I'm going to keep raising the rent, raising the price, and unless the government can say, you know what, screw this, we're going to take it anyway because it's fair market value, it would make it very difficult to build a republic. And that's why from the earliest days, even the Fifth Amendment, there was a recognition that when the government takes property, they would have to provide some sort of compensation for it. You couldn't say no. Now, the limitation, though, Chester, I'll get to you in a second. The limitation, though, of the Fifth Amendment, and it's an important limitation, is it can't take property for any purpose. That's for public use, right? So if you read that language, public use, as it's written, that means something that the public will use. In later cases, the Supreme Court said, oh, no, that doesn't mean public use. It means public purpose, that if any sort of taking benefits the public, it can be seizing your private property. If you want to build a hotel or build an office complex, that's that. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Is property defined as real estate, or I know like in World War II?
What a good question.
Yeah. I know in World War II, steel mills were taken over briefly or something.
Oh God, one of my favorite cases, Youngstown, right?
Yeah.
Did you know that Youngstown was a takings clause case? No one even appreciates that. Only people who teach common property appreciate it. The question was this: could President Truman, as executive, seize the steel mills? Did the executive branch have the takings power, or did the legislative branch have that power? That was the entire case, right? Did the legislative branch give the president power to seize mills? Didn't have it on his own. The court said no. Congress did not give him that power. So absolutely, Youngstown was a takings case. I thought you were going to ask about real property versus personal property versus interest, right? What if the government does something which diminishes your bank account, right, and you lose some interest? Is that a taking? The answer is no. So it's generally real property. Chester, I think your hand was up before I skipped you. I'm sorry.
So could you correlate eminent domain with necessity for the government?
Yeah. Well, the government doesn't have to prove that taking this black acre is necessary. They just have to say, we're taking because it's for public use, right? So I'll give you an example. Let's say that there are two different paths through which a road can be built, right? There's got black acre and there's white acre. Let's just say black acre is going to be a lot cheaper, a lot easier, but they decide to take white acre anyway. There's no court decision saying that's unconstitutional, that you have to take this over that. So the answer is it's not necessary, but the government determines that something's for public use. That's it. The courts don't scrutinize, well, why did you take this one over that one, right? They're taking whichever one they want. It's a pretty awesome power. Questions on this? Yes, Adam?
Universities have eminent domain,
They do.
but they can advertise it as a Fifth Amendment.
Oh, they do. So if a state university has eminent domain, it's actually not the university, but the local, every city has basically eminent domain commissions, all different things, but the eminent domain commission is exercising the basis of this university, right? So I think a couple of years ago, UT wanted to build a campus in Houston, is that what you're thinking of? And they wanted to use eminent domain, and they could have. All right? Now, we'll get that. Now, I think Simone was next, so I'll get back to eventually now. But the question is this. We already said, Fifth Amendment, right? The property is not being physically taken. Then you have to argue, Simone, why would a zoning ordinance that restricts usage be inconsistent with the 14th Amendment's due process clause? What's the argument there? You're a lawyer in the 1920s. What's the argument for why a zoning law in the 1920s runs afoul of the due process clause? What's the argument? What's the argument? Well, I mean, what was Euclid all about? Why would this law run afoul of the 14th Amendment? Why was the Euclid zoning law perhaps without due process of law? I'm sorry? Chester?
Your question again?
What's the argument for why the Village of Euclid zoning law would run afoul of the 14th Amendment?
Would it be that they would still argue that they're deprived, they're being deprived of their property first?
But are they being deprived of their property?
They're not being deprived, but the value is being lessened. That's their argument.
But wasn't there some sort of hearing or trial before this?
There was a hearing, but they said it was like, I guess you call it arbitrary or political. I guess it's too early.
You use this word arbitrary. What does that mean, arbitrary?
Almost like they haven't been harmed, or it's yet to be seen that, the property can be deprived by the zoning law.
Walker, the courts judge the wisdom of government action. In other words, are courts in business deciding whether this is a reasonable zoning law or unreasonable? What does that mean? You always say, is it reasonable, right? What does that body that mean? Is it reasonable?
Whether there's like a substantial reason for doing so.
Okay, is it a reason to find reason? What's substantial reason? What's substantial reason?
Like, if there's a legitimate purpose for them doing it.
What's a legitimate mean? I'm doing this on purpose, I promise. You give me really good synonyms for the same thing. What does it mean for a law to be reasonable, legitimate? Give me whatever synonym you want me to source out.
That's a tough question.
I know, so I'm asking you something. What does it mean? How does a judge decide if a zoning law is reasonable or arbitrary, Chester's word, or legitimate, Walker's word, right? What does that mean?
That it goes for the goal that they set out, and it's not the only way, I guess. Like, if there was another way, maybe, then it's not the most legitimate.
I mean, you guys should comment up here. What does it mean for something to be reasonable? What are we talking about here?
Well, in the case, they use the language substantial relation to public health, safety, morals, or the general welfare.
Okay. How do you know if something has a relationship that's substantial to health and safety?
Just a good faith. Good faith plausibility. What they say.
Thomas, did the Village of Euclid, when they enacted this law, were they acting totally irrationally? They were just make crap up?
No.
Or what did they think they were doing?
No, they were making it so, different parts of the city were, it was safe to live in, resident only, or,
Why? Then why is that not enough? Why, if the legislature enacted it, why is that not enough to?
Did they say it was legitimate?
The legislature did. The Village of Euclid said this is fine.
Yeah.
Why is that the end of the story?
Was it because the plaintiff actually didn't even apply for a permit to,
That's true. Why am I doing this? Right? Why put you through this misery?
There's a hand over there.
Basically, the answer is, I got it. Okay, try it this way. Why am I doing this to you? What am I getting at? What's this entire exercise getting at? I promise that. Exactly. I promise you. He's trying to punt it, but Why am I doing this to you?
I mean, the courts generally don't go after the question the reasonableness of going back to the original question.
The courts assess the reasonableness. So the question is, right? Is this an exercise of the police power, or simply unreasonable? Right? Does this regulation go too far and deprive a person their value? Even though they're at a hearing, is it still inconsistent with due process of the law? Lane, tell us, what were you trying to bail out your classmate on?
I did have a question. I was just gonna say, like, that's normally determined by the fact finder. There's no like strict standard what reasonable is.
There is not. There is not. So let's keep going with this. John Paul. I promise we'll get to the case eventually. This is why I only found one case today. John Paul, what does due process of law mean? I'm sure you studied it for 2 months in common law. What's the phrase due process of law?
Means that the government is supposed to enact laws that are reasonable, arbitrary.
Where is the word reasonable? It says only you can't be deprived of profit that due process of law.
Affecting the public interest, its actual interest in the public interest.
You're not answering my question. What does due process of law mean? You're giving me other stuff. What is due process of law?
According to the right to hearing.
That is just a hearing. That all it means?
The laws that everyone's right to view or have the ability to.
What's due process of law?
One thing about it, it's also the gift of due process where it's also keeping it equal. Equal rights.
So, did anyone ever read the short story The Lottery? You want to tell me about it? No, you're next.
The lottery, I think, in high school was kind of long ago for me, but
It's okay.
I took advantage. I think it was like, there was this story about how it was a big honor to be drawn this lottery, but really, it was not like the Hunger Games.
Yeah, actually, so the story of this, and I'll summarize it briefly. You have this town, and the story opens up, and there was going to be a drawing, right? And then everyone would draw a piece of paper from this, like a stove, I think, right? This piece of paper from this box. And one piece of paper from this box had a marking on it, right? And they go through this entire process, and they draw it. And the process of drawing the paper is fair. It's totally random, totally arbitrary, right? You know, you just pick a piece of paper out of a hat. And after you draw the paper, the person who draws is this woman, right? And that's what they start doing to her. She gets stoned to death. Start throwing rocks at her and kill her. Shocking, right? You didn't expect that when you start reading it. And she was saying, as she was getting stoned to death, this is not fair. This is not fair. Now, Robert, was the process fair by which you drew the piece of paper?
It was arbitrary.
Was it fair? Was there any cheating involved? Was it rigged? Was it weighted at all?
I think it was random.
So was the process fair?
I don't want to say yes.
Whoa, that's it. Was the process fair? It was random. There's no cheating. It was rigged. No one looked behind the curtain. Yeah, I don't need to do a poll on this one, but I think I probably know the answer. I got 50-50. Yeah. I use this case to explain the due process clause. The mere fact that a process is regular, that is, there's no cheating, doesn't make it fair. Because as humans, we have this innate sense of that's not fair. Anyone have a little sister or brother, and like the first thing says, that's not fair, right? Don't kids always say that? And I find it fascinating that people are just born with this sense of justice. It's like hardwired. It's like when you're like, oh, he took my cracker, that's not fair, right? That's my sister always, that's not fair, that's not fair. But the due process clause embodies that concept that merely because you're given a hearing with a judge that's neutral doesn't mean that the law itself is fair. So the argument, to go back to Simone's question 15 minutes ago, right? Why is this zoning law a violation of the due process clause? Because it's arbitrary. It's unfair. Why is this woman getting stoned versus that woman getting stoned, right? It's totally, completely random. How come this part of the property is for residential and 1 foot away is for commercial, right? How do you chop up the same piece of property 3 different ways, or 4 different ways, whatever it was? Is there any rhyme or reason to why you chop the property this way? It's completely arbitrary. Now, granted, getting stoned to death is a hell of a lot worse than chopping up your property in 3 different categories. But the base argument is the same, that it's completely arbitrary to do this, to have a zoning law. Or is it? So what the court discusses here, the Euclid case, is that it's not arbitrary to divide up the property in this fashion. Why? I think Thomas said a minute ago, because it relates to health and safety. And if the government can determine that there's some rational reason why this has to be 6 and this one has to be 2 and that one has to be 3 in the middle, which basically makes the entire property worthless, courts are not going to second guess that. Right? This is the beginning of the development of what we would call rational basis review. We learned that's in Connell last term, right? That so long as the government possesses some sort of rational basis on which to act, it doesn't have to be perfect, it does not have to be necessary. It just has to not be crazy, right? Not insane. And then the courts will say that's good enough for us. That if it makes it through the democratic process, these zoning boards, not really democratic, but makes it through these zoning boards, that is adequate. Everyone see? That is what's at the basis of the due process clause. This is such an arbitrarily and utterly random process. Oh, if this is 6, this is 3, and this is 2, and you can't even build anything useful over there. Basically only build commercial at that point. Alright? Everyone with me? Thank you. Alright, so at long last, who's next? That's it?
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Virginia. Virginia, please. Let's do the facts of Euclid, please. It's 30 minutes in the making, or an hour in the making, but we'll get there, I promise. Yeah, that's why I only signed 1 case, so you're wondering. If I ever sign 1 case, it means you gotta read it carefully. My general rule. Alright. Give me the facts, please, Virginia.
So Euclid was a suburb of Cleveland.
Good.
And was Ambler.
Good.
Ambler Realty owned land within Euclid. And Euclid had some really, to me, complex zoning ordinances.
You're exactly right.
There was like 3 different, there was a use zoning thing, a height, and an area. But they were all comprehensive, so, if you got up to U5, you could do everything below that, but you can't go above U5. And so Ambler's land was partitioned because of these zoning ordinances. And they, so I think it was like they couldn't do industry. And then, so Ambler sued because I think they said it was depriving their liberty of property without due process.
Very good. So I want to walk you through the specifics of how these zoning laws operate. And I think Virginia is the right word, comprehensive. They regulate different aspects of usage. So the first is usage, right? What sorts of things are you allowed to build on there? Single-family homes, 2-family dwellings. The second category concerns height. That is, how tall can various structures be on the property. And the third category is what's called area, right? How many square feet are allowed? What's the minimum square footage allowed? Now, the general notion is keep certain constructions in certain places. That is, if you zone a place to have single-family homes that are 2 stories tall, that are more than, say, 5,000 square feet, you're attracting a certain kind of person. Wealthy people. right? There's not any other way to describe it. The more restraints you have on the size of property, the more expensive it becomes. And the more expensive it becomes, it makes it harder for poor people to buy property. If you look at the Euclid decision, they describe apartments as parasites. Everyone see that one? Everyone is saying, whoa, what's going on there? The pig in the parlor, right? This case was argued at a time where the Supreme Court was generally very protective of property rights. In fact, the following year, in 26, the Supreme Court struck down a minimum wage law in the District of Columbia as a violation of liberty of contract. That opinion was by Justice Sutherland. Why is Justice Sutherland here voting to uphold the zoning ordinance, which is a significant restriction on property rights? And the story is, and who knows if these things are true, but the story goes that this was basically a justice is saying we don't want people crowding into our nice suburbs. It's an exclusionary method, and apparently the case was argued the first time, and there were votes to strike down the zoning ordinance as unconstitutional. And then there was this late filed amicus brief, a friend of the court brief by the head of the building commission, whatever it was called. And he wrote to Chief Justice Taft, who was his friend from Cincinnati, saying, "Oh, could you please file this brief late, which is never allowed." He said, "Yeah, sure, file it." And after it was re-argued the following year, the votes flipped, and it was 6-3. And you had Justice Sutherland, again, who was one of the conservative justices in the court, wrote the majority opinion, and you had in dissent Justices Van de Vant, McReynolds, and Butler. These were three of the four so-called horsemen of the apocalypse, right? The four horsemen who would strike down a lot of New Deal legislation. But the court sided with the zoning ordinance. So let me walk you through how these things work. It works like a pyramid, right? At the top of the pyramid is called U1, right? U1. Here, up here. Right? U1. This was single family. Right? Single family homes, you had to have a basement and at least 3 rooms and a bathroom. Right? This is going to be pretty expensive. Right? You can't have multiple families living there. It's one family by itself. You're going to ask me, Josh, what's the definition of a family? We'll do a case in a couple weeks. How do you define a family? It's actually a case on that. Okay? U2, not the band, is a 2-family dwelling, right? But here's how it works: when you have land that's zoned as U1, you can only build a single-family dwelling. You can't build a 2-family dwelling. However, when you have land that's zoned U2, you can do either, right? You can build a single-family or a 2-family dwelling. As you go down the pyramid, you can build whatever you want. But as you go up, it's restricted.
Are these designations specifically for this case, or is this in general?
This is pretty general. These categories are, I mean, they might be called different things, but they're pretty consistent. Okay? Then we have U3, right? Which is apartment. And again, if land is zoned U3, you can build a 1-family house there, or a 2-family house there, or an apartment building. But you cannot build an apartment in land that's zoned U2 or U1. So it's comprehensive. The other 4, U4 are like offices. I'll look at these quickly. U5, a warehouse. And U6, my favorite, the sewage, right? And then garbage. Okay? Okay, and then U7, it's basically everything's prohibited. You can't build anything there. Maybe that might be like a wetland or something where you can't build. So this is how the usages were defined. Now turn to the map, right? We have this map that was in your book. And you have this plot of land that's owned. And on the same given plot of land, it's zoned in 3 different ways. So basically the front, quarter or so, which is fronting the road, is zoned as U2. So you can build a, you can build a 2-family dwelling. And this little narrow strip here, which doesn't seem very large at all, you have it zoned U3, right? And then in this back part, the part that's fronting the railroad, you have U6. Okay? So Lauren, you're a developer, right? You own a piece of land. What on earth can you do with this fragmented structure? What could you actually build there throughout the entire property that would actually make sense? Yeah, under this, yes. What could you actually do, like, realistically speaking?
Well, you can do residential, and it would comply to all the rules, since it's comprehensive.
Right, so let me, I actually have the Google map here, right? So you can see what it looks like. So Lauren says you can just build residential for the entire thing, right? So this is what it looks like, right? This is Euclid Avenue. Let me rotate a little bit. So this is Euclid Avenue right over here. And you can see it's basically all industrial. And actually I got some photographs of what's there now. It's all industrial usage. Now, Lauren's right. If you want, right, you could build residential 2-family homes here, here, and here. Now, Lauren, what's the problem with building residential homes on this lot? Yeah. What's the problem with
Well,
building?
at this point, at U6, you can have sewage and all this other stuff there too. So now you create a problem for nuisance.
Yeah, and what are you right next to? If you're on this lot over here, you said.
Garbage.
And the railroad.
Right.
Train, exactly. So this zoning, the reason why it was U6 is it's not very desirable for family homes. You're right by the railroad tracks, probably garbage, sewage, whatever else. So effectively, all you can do there is build residential maybe in the first half of the property and on the second half. Now, Elena, which property tends to generate more money? Commercial or residential? Exactly why?
Well, because if they sell it, so
Yeah, right. So this looks like the perfect space to put commercial property, right? And again, I'll show you the photographs. There's actually an office park there now. You had a developer want to build all commercial in this area right by the railroad, maybe even drops off by the tracks, but instead you are now stuck with building residential property that you aren't, right? No one's going to live. Right, no one's going to live next to the railroad tracks right there for a nice 2-family home. And you can't do apartments because the apartment is only a small sliver, right? So, Elena, what happened? What was challenged in this case? Why was this 3-structure thing viewed as unconstitutional?
Well, it was challenged because the restrictions would devalue the
How so?
the property, because it's more expensive to have a property with more restrictions on it, and less people are going to want to buy it.
Okay, very good. So this was challenged under, let's go back to our amendments, the 5th and the 14th Amendments. And they first argued that, this deprives me of the value of my property, it's taking, give me money. That didn't go anywhere, so I don't want to focus much on that. So Hanan, what's the argument that this the 3 structures, 3 zones, runs afoul of the 14th Amendment? What's the argument that the lawyers would make here?
I think it was they're depriving him of property because it was valued differently depending on how he sold it.
Good. Now, I don't know if you have any background, Hanan, in land use planning, but just pretend for a moment you do, right? Does it make any sense whatsoever why the same plot of land we chopped up in 3 different zones like this, why can we make the entire thing commercial? Does it make any sense why they would do this? Not to me, to anyone?
I'm sure the central planners who drew it up had some sort of ulterior motive.
Oh, I love you this stuff. What ulterior motives? What are you talking about, my friend?
Oftentimes, the people that make these decisions craft them in a way that gives an advantage to either themselves or their friends.
Are you saying that people in government have illegitimate motives and they provide facially neutral reasons for their actions, but they actually have other reasons why? Is that what you're asserting?
Certainly sometimes.
Sometimes. Okay, you're not wrong, right? When governments act, they often have. Oops, you right? When governments act, the individual people in government often have various motives. So I think Hanan's right. This map makes absolutely no sense, right? Why is this going to be 6 and you move over 5 feet, it's a 3, and that's a 2, it's in the exact same plot of land? Why can't you just make the entire thing 6? The court, though, does not go down that route. Lindsay, what does the court say about scrutinizing these things so closely? Why is the Supreme Court, Justice Sutherland, not taking Hanan's route and say this is stupid, it's unconstitutional, right? What does the court say about why this should be upheld?
Well, because it's a part of the police power.
Why is it part of the police power? That's the question.
It's like, it's the will of the people.
What do you mean the will of the people?
Well, they want it to be half residential, and I guess half industrial, and I don't know.
Megan, you want to take a stab? I'm actually not really asking you, but if you please take a stab. Why is the court basically saying here that yeah, this is constitutional, that this is an exercise of police power? Looking at this map, it makes no sense to me, and I don't know much about this stuff, but it looks pretty stupid to me if I'm a judge. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. But within the police power, they do have the ability to separate industrial and residential.
Why? Why should they have that power from the police power?
Because it's like for the health and, I mean,
okay.
This necessarily doesn't really
You said necessarily.
Yeah.
Is that word in the court's analysis? Does it must necessarily relate to health and safety? What's all that's required? What's the only...
That's reasonable.
Reasonable. Anthony, what's the relationship that needs to happen between this sort of zoning 3 thing, whatever, and the police power? What health and safety? What do you have to find? What's the connection? What's the nexus?
Well, I mean, from what I read, they said that they weren't going to strike down zoning laws generally, even if they have a small impact on the owner of that one plot.
Small impact? William, what's the connection that has to happen in order? What's all the court's going to review for?
Rational basis, right?
Basic rational basis. What does that mean?
So, if they can just find some reason that isn't just silly to them.
Yeah. And then Kaylee, what's the reason, right? What's the reason they give of why these sort of usage zones should be upheld? What's the reason given?
I guess basically to keep the land separate for
Exactly. The reason why separating land is reasonable is because it separates land.
Yeah, and also it separates classes of people.
Yes, exactly. Listen to what you said. The reason why separating these 3 lands is reasonable is because the government wants to separate land. Everyone with me, right? The power to separate land is justified because the government has the ability to separate land. Now, I said, Josh, that's circular. Well, of course it is. This is Isaac's point maybe a couple minutes ago, right? They say, look, it's maybe in an urban, in a rural environment. It doesn't really matter where things are, but in an increasingly populated area, the government has a right to determine who lives where and what sort of properties are built in what locations, right? And once you accept that conclusion, that the separation of properties is part of the police power, that you don't want pigs and parlors, right? And you don't want parasites coming into your neighborhood, right? That's it. That's in the police power. That makes it reasonable. That makes it legitimate. That makes it non-arbitrary. And as a result, the courts uphold it. So the basis of this opinion, and the reason why they have to go through that entire discussion of pigs and parlors and other stuff, like why are they writing this? What they're saying is, we recognize the importance of the police power to separate land use. And because of that, the police power can then be upheld to separate land uses. It's utterly circular. You see it, right? It's a complete circle. But this decision, which blessed what became to call Euclidean zoning, like Euclidean zoning, which is an awesome name because Euclid was the father of geometry, right? The Greek guy. So it's called Euclidean zoning. And they say this is well within the police power. Yeah.
You were talking about, I don't really understand the whole circle thing, but you were asking about the connection, what connection there is, and the courts say that it's not an abstract consideration of what's going on with the building, so like whatever reasonable person like the man would say, she would, right? But it says, but by considering in connection with the circumstances and the locality. So does that mean like even if it were, like Isaac said, a situation where you might have ulterior motives or there is like a sort of type of collusion within the locality of the decision making?
What the zoning board operates,
Is it still functional? Is it still valid? Like it doesn't violate the...
We will, we'll do a case, so let me answer your question this way, I say. This was a challenge, what's called a facial challenge, right? This was a challenge to the entire zoning law as a whole, right? So the court says, we're not gonna strike down zoning laws, period. But we'll do cases next week where someone got the permit denied and they allege sort of ulterior motives to the church, right? When you do an as-applied challenge on a case-by-case basis, courts can say this application is unreasonable. But what they will not say is that the entire scheme is unreasonable. Does that make sense? The difference, right? To this day, courts can intervene and, on rare occasion, find that a zoning board acted unreasonably. But they won't come in and do what was asked for in Euclid and strike down the entire zoning ordinance. So we'll see the difference, right? So the rest of this topic, we'll spend some time about it, another week or two, focuses on case-by-case problems. But Euclid, this case from 1925 or 26, greenlighted the entire process, right? Once Euclid upheld the idea of a zoning ordinance in the abstract, at that point, states do whatever they want, unless it's a case-by-case challenge. Make sense?
So Euclidean zoning is
good.
The case-by-case locality determines the connection.
Yeah, right. You can have a Euclidean zoning ordinance, but if it's implemented in an arbitrary fashion on a case-by-case basis, that's where individual challenges will arise. Makes sense. Questions? All right. So why is this case so important? It expanded the scope of the police power. And it said the power of the police power, includes the ability to keep like things alike and different things separate. Keep all the residential together in this part of town, keep all the commercial together in that part of town, and put the apartment in some other area of the law. Okay? This is a core attribute of zoning. And it was a fairly novel concept, the fact that the government could separate land based on how it was used. That was never anything common law came. Questions on that? I want to talk about Houston for a little bit because it was mentioned in your readings. So I used to actually teach an entire class of Houston and zoning, but the schedule just doesn't permit it, so I cut it. But let me talk a little bit about Houston for a minute. There's a popular belief that Houston lacks zoning, and it's true in the narrow sense. There have been several efforts over the years to amend the Houston City Charter to permit zoning. In fact, the Houston City Charter has a provision saying that to enact zoning, you need a ballot referendum. And it's been a ballot, I think, 2 or 3 times, and both times it was defeated. But that doesn't mean Houston has, sort of Wild West, unregulated land use. And there are various things that are used in Houston that come close to it. Okay, so the first thing to keep in mind of Houston is deed restrictions. We don't need to have a zoning ordinance limiting usage because most subdivisions are already restricted by deeds and covenants. And what that means is when a person subdivides a land, they'll put a covenant in it that says only one-family homes. And that has just as much effect as a zoning ordinance would. In fact, it's even more effective. But not all property is deed restricted. So that's why you can have, by the Galleria, the mall right next to Zona Ratik, right? Everyone knows about this? It's actually closing down. I'm only sad not to have ever been, but because it's a good property story. When I first moved to Houston, I actually stayed at the Sheraton Hotel right by the Galleria. I'm like, what the hell is this? There's like a porn shop by the mall, and I'm like, oh, Houston, right? And then it hit me. Zoning, yeah. So you can have, you know, a hotel building across the street from a commercial facility, across the street from one family home, right? In no other city can you have single family homes across the street from skyscrapers. It just doesn't exist, but we have that here because you don't have that restriction. Another way that Houston has a somewhat quasi-zoning is what's called the minimum lot size, where at least inside the loop, inside the 610 loop, there were certain restrictions on how small property could be. Not how big, how small. It was a minimum lot size. And the effect of that is basically space homes out apart, which might seem nice, but when you have a very big property, you can fit fewer homes in a block, right? And the effect of that is that blocks tend to get bigger. So you have fewer homes on bigger blocks, and this is what we call sprawl, right? Things sort of spread out in Houston. Another restriction, which was designed to deal with the fact that we have such a sprawled out population, is wide streets, right? Streets are very wide. And that was designed to allow cars to drive better. You know, if you've ever tried to cross 610 in Westheimer, I bless you, I would never attempt to do it. I don't think I can make it across quickly enough. I would take a cab before I'm trying to cross that. The wide streets, though, have the consequence of making things not very walkable. I'm sure people appreciate in Houston because you have very narrow sidewalks, if any sidewalks at all. So what you basically have is spread out properties, very long streets, and very small sidewalks with wide roads that make it hard to cross over. There are also restrictions which are again premised on the drivability of the city, where you're required to have a certain number of parking spots for each business. And you're required to have a certain number of parking spots in apartment complexes. So if you, I think it's like for every one bedroom apartment, you need 1.25 parking spots. Or I think that's the number. So you basically need more parking spots than apartments or bedrooms. And the effect is you actually have larger parking structures. So again, Houston doesn't have any sort of formal zoning code, but they do have things that closely approximate it. Now, there's an ongoing case that you're probably all familiar with, and I may have mentioned it before, which is the so-called Ashby high-rise. Anyone roughly familiar with this? No one? Wow, okay, it's been quiet recently. So if you ever drive down Bissonnette near the Museum District near Rice Village, you'll see these signs over the place. The Stop Ashby High-Rise Tower. Have you never seen these signs? Yeah, good. You've seen them, right? Stop the Ashby High-Rise. So there was initial plans to build a high-rise apartment complex at Ashby and Bissonnette, which is right between the museum, the Museum District and where Rice Village is. Now, again, Houston has no zoning code, so there was nothing saying you can only have one family homes here. They wanted to build a tall high-rise. The neighbors, who are pretty wealthy in that area, freaked out, and they tried to do everything that they could to stop it. They said, oh, it will create traffic, it will block sunlight, it will create noise. And these things wound through the courts, and ultimately the court said, no, it's good to build. And at the last minute, as they were about to break ground, a lawsuit was filed claiming that the construction of the high-rise was a nuisance. Now, what was the argument why it was a nuisance? It was out of place. That the character of the neighborhood is one-family homes, not a high-rise. This is Euclid, right? That the police power includes the ability to separate land based on its use. But Houston doesn't have that attribute of the police power. It's been disabled by the voters. So they sued, saying that this was a nuisance. And they did a very strange decision, one that I more or less have come to agree with, not completely. The court said that yes, it's a nuisance. Building something out of place that doesn't fit in with the character neighborhood is a nuisance. But they did not issue an injunction. They did not issue an injunction. They awarded damages. A one-time award of damages. This is boomer, right? Let them build and pay them for the inconvenience. Now this case has been on appeal to the Court of Appeals for almost like 2 years now. I don't know what the hell's going on. It's taking forever. Every time I teach this class, still nothing's changed. I've been teaching that for almost 6 years, the same story. Nothing's been built there, it's all an empty lot. But the argument is, what makes it a nuisance is that it's out of place. And the Texas courts have accepted it. I need to take reversed. I don't think it's going to stand. But that's the decision for now. But what we're seeing here in Houston is an attempt to use nuisance law to achieve a zoning power, right? There's a big difference. With zoning, you need a permit before you build. Here, this litigation has been resolved for years before you can even break ground, right? It's this weird thing that's been going on forever. So it's a strange extension of zoning law here. So questions on Houston and the Ashby high-rise and any of that sort of things? By the way, one of the reasons why housing is so much more affordable in Houston than other big cities is, in large part, because we don't have a zoning code. It's a lot cheaper to build. I have friends who are in law school in D.C. and New York, and their houses cost 5 times what they cost here. It's not even a close call. So, any questions on Houston? Your beloved city. Yes, Rob.
I was like, it seems like these restrictions have been set up specifically to make the city really wide, like minimum parking requirements, minimum whatever.
Yeah.
But everything every city I've ever been in is always like urban sprawl has been described as a bad thing. So what was the thinking?
Is sprawl a bad thing?
I don't really know, but it's
I
just
don't know either. I don't study that close enough to have an informed opinion. But I think the laws developed somewhat of that of necessity. Because you have these different lot sizes, houses are more spread out. And because houses are spread out, people have longer commutes. And to alleviate the longer commutes, make the roads wider. I think I read this somewhere that where I-10 and 610 intersect, it's actually the widest highway in the world. If you count all the service roads, the feeder roads on the side, it's like the most lanes of any highway in the world. So there's that. But I think it was a conflict. Yes, Hannah?
I thought it was about oil and gas. Like using oil and gas
I don't know. That could be. But generally, I think the parking spaces, the wide roads, the response stations for that. Sort of, yeah. Questions? All right, let me summarize. Yeah, example.
One of the things I noticed, especially after Washington, was a series of warehouses, old industrial warehouses that were converted into residential areas.
Yeah, the loss, right?
So, are we approaching a situation where it will essentially be inverse, where commercial will try to enact zoning?
I don't know, but I can probably use a market to make that decision because it's possible. Right? You don't have to rezone the land to do that. So what you have to keep in mind, let me summarize a bit for today. When you're looking at a zoning or a takings question, you have to remember both the 5th and the 14th Amendments, right? You have to ask yourselves, does this actually amount to taking a property or so compensation required? But even if it's not a compensation required taking, you still need to consider the police power. And whether depriving a person of that right is, use your word, reasonable, arbitrary, legitimate, whatever word you want, same damn thing, right? Is there a good reason why? And invariably that's a judgment that the judge will make. What Euclid says is, we're not going to make broad judgments by entire zoning codes, but they still will make case-by-case determinations as applied. Anything else? I will see you all on Tuesday. Thank you.